Pastor James Wilkes was a man whose life appeared to be the epitome of success and righteousness. At 62, he had spent decades building his reputation as a spiritual leader and a community cornerstone. His church stood as a symbol of power and prestige, attracting congregants from all walks of life. Behind the pulpit, his sermons were eloquent and impassioned, earning him the unwavering loyalty of his flock. Beyond the church, James wielded influence like a finely honed blade. He owned stakes in local businesses, his financial ventures subtly intertwined with the lives of those around him. His connections with influential figures, politicians, law enforcement, and business leaders ensured that his status was unassailable. Despite his public image, James carried a weighty loneliness. His life of leadership, wealth, and respect left no room for vulnerability or genuine companionship. He had learned to bury his desires, convincing himself that his position demanded it. But beneath the polished surface, James yearned for someone to fill the void in his life, someone who could see past the grandeur and touch the man beneath. The catalyst came one Sunday morning during a service. Among the congregation sat Daniel, a young man in his early 20s with a quiet presence that stood out against the crowd. Daniel's demeanor was unassuming yet magnetic, his downcast eyes and shy smile hinted at humility, while his attentive posture suggested a sincerity rare in others his age. He attended the service with his girlfriend, Lila, who seemed to be his opposite, outgoing, talkative, and quick to engage with those around her. James noticed them immediately, his gaze lingering on Daniel longer than he intended. As weeks passed, Daniel became a regular attendee at the church. James found himself drawn to the young man's presence, noting the way he participated in the service with genuine intent. Daniel's modesty and warmth stirred something dormant in James, a feeling that was both exhilarating and unsettling. He began orchestrating opportunities to interact with Daniel, subtly positioning himself as a mentor. Under the guise of nurturing the younger man's spiritual growth, James invited Daniel to join him in the church's outreach programs, organizing food drives and assisting with community events. Daniel accepted these invitations with a mix of gratitude and deference. He admired the pastor's wisdom and dedication, unaware of the undercurrent of personal interest driving James's actions. James, for his part, became increasingly bold in his pursuit of closeness. He ensured that Daniel's contributions were recognized, lavishing him with praise in front of others. He also offered small gestures of kindness, covering a utility bill for Daniel's struggling family, arranging a job interview for a friend, or providing funds for Lila's educational aspirations. These acts cemented James's role as a benefactor in Daniel's life. Yet, James could not escape the tension brewing within him. His attraction to Daniel was growing more intense, pushing against the boundaries of propriety. In private moments, he questioned his motives, struggling to reconcile his feelings with his role as a pastor. He rationalized his actions as acts of kindness and mentorship, but deep down, he knew his intentions were far from pure. The internal conflict gnawed at him, fueling his determination to win Daniel's affection while maintaining the illusion of selflessness. James's efforts to deepen their connection were not lost on Lila. She began to notice the pastor's disproportionate interest in Daniel, though she could not articulate why it bothered her. She dismissed her unease as jealousy, telling herself that James's attention was merely a reflection of Daniel's worth. Daniel himself remained oblivious, viewing James's generosity as an extension of the pastor's role as a leader and caregiver. In his private quarters, James wrestled with his growing obsession. He found himself replaying conversations with Daniel in his mind, lingering on moments of shared laughter or fleeting touches. The young man's voice, his smile, and even his vulnerabilities became etched into James's thoughts. For the first time in years, James felt alive, but the cost of this awakening was the erosion of his self-control. He began to imagine a future where Daniel was by his side, a partner in his personal life as much as in his spiritual mission. This fantasy, however, came with a significant obstacle: Lila. James recognized that her presence in Daniel's life was an impediment to his desires. Her unwavering support and affection for Daniel reinforced the young man's loyalty to her, creating a barrier James could not easily overcome. As the weeks turned into months, James's thoughts turned darker. He began contemplating ways to remove Lila from the equation, rationalizing his intentions as a necessary step toward his own happiness and Daniel's liberation. Unbeknownst to Daniel or Lila, James had set his sights on a dangerous course. The seeds of his plan were taking root, and the pastor who had spent a lifetime guiding others toward salvation was preparing to step into the shadows of sin and deception. Daniel had initially been flattered by Pastor James's attention. As someone who had grown up in modest circumstances, struggling to support his family and navigate the challenges of young adulthood, Daniel saw James as a mentor and a source of stability. The pastor's gestures of generosity seemed genuine, covering tuition costs, paying for car repairs, and even assisting Daniel's mother with her mounting medical bills. James's wealth and influence became a safety net for Daniel, and he was deeply grateful. Their bond, at first, appeared to be one of mutual respect and trust. Over time, however, their relationship began to shift. James's interest in Daniel became more personal and less about mentorship. He began spending long hours with him, inviting him to dinner or private discussions that extended late into the night. The conversations often veered into deeply emotional territory, with James sharing stories of his struggles, his loneliness, and his longing for someone who truly understood him. Daniel, empathetic by nature, felt drawn to James's vulnerability. He began to see the pastor not just as a benefactor but as a man with desires and pain of his own. The turning point came during one of their late-night meetings. James expressed his feelings more openly, his words carrying a weight that Daniel could no longer ignore. At first, Daniel was stunned. The idea of someone as revered and powerful as James harboring romantic feelings for him was both shocking and intriguing. Daniel had never considered such a possibility, but as he reflected on their time together, he realized that his feelings for James were more complex than he had admitted to himself. Despite his growing affection for James, Daniel couldn't ignore the complication that was Lila. She had been his partner for years, a constant in his tumultuous life. Lila's love was unwavering, and she had supported him through his struggles without hesitation. The thought of hurting her was unbearable. Yet, the more time he spent with James, the more he felt himself being pulled in two directions. The pastor's unwavering attention and emotional depth awakened something in Daniel that he hadn't felt before, a sense of being truly seen and valued. The conflict within Daniel grew more pronounced as James began to push for more. The pastor, emboldened by Daniel's reciprocation, wanted their relationship to evolve into something deeper and more exclusive. He promised Daniel a life of comfort and security, offering access to his wealth and influence. James envisioned a future where they could be together without secrecy or fear, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that future a reality. For Daniel, the pressure was overwhelming. He found himself juggling the expectations of two people who loved him in different ways. Lila, unaware of the growing rift, continued to support Daniel, her devotion unwavering. Meanwhile, James grew increasingly insistent, his patience wearing thin as Daniel struggled to make a choice. The tension between the three of them, whether spoken or unspoken, loomed like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. As the weeks passed, the cracks in Daniel's life became harder to conceal. He began to withdraw from Lila, his guilt manifesting in avoidance and half-hearted excuses. She noticed the change but attributed it to stress, never suspecting the true cause. Daniel's time with James, meanwhile, grew more intense. Their private moments were charged with emotion, but they were also fraught with the unspoken reality of Daniel's indecision. James, accustomed to getting what he wanted, began to grow impatient. He saw Lila as an obstacle, someone who was holding Daniel back from embracing the life they could have together. The pastor's frustration bubbled beneath the surface, coloring his interactions with Daniel. While he maintained a veneer of understanding, it was clear that he expected Daniel to make a choice, and soon. Caught between his loyalties to Lila and his feelings for James, Daniel felt like he was living two lives. The weight of his deception began to take a toll on him, but he couldn't bring himself to sever ties with either of them. He rationalized his actions, telling himself that he needed more time to figure things out, but deep down, he knew that his indecision was hurting everyone involved. The balance Daniel tried so desperately to maintain was unsustainable. James's demands for exclusivity grew louder, while Lila's oblivious devotion became a constant reminder of the betrayal he was committing. The fragile web of lies and half-truths he had constructed was beginning to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. James's frustration with Daniel's indecision reached a breaking point. In his mind, Lila was the single obstacle preventing them from fully embracing the life he envisioned together. He had convinced himself that her presence in Daniel's life was not only unnecessary but detrimental. She didn't understand Daniel the way he did, nor could she offer him the opportunities and support that James could provide. James rationalized that by removing Lila, he was freeing Daniel from a relationship that was holding him back. It wasn't an act of malice, he told himself, it was an act of love. The plan began to take shape in James's mind with alarming clarity. He decided that the only way to eliminate Lila without arousing suspicion was to disguise his actions as an unfortunate accident. James carefully orchestrated an invitation, asking Lila to join him for a private dinner at the church's rectory. He framed the request as a gesture of goodwill, telling her that he wanted to discuss Daniel's future and how they could work together to support him. Lila, trusting James as a spiritual leader, readily agreed. In the days leading up to the dinner, James prepared meticulously. He procured a lethal poison, one that would act subtly and without immediate symptoms. He researched the dosage carefully, ensuring it would be undetectable in a casual setting. The wine he selected was expensive, chosen deliberately to lower Lila's guard and make her feel at ease. Every detail of the evening was planned to appear natural, from the arrangement of the table to the choice of topics he intended to discuss. When the evening arrived, James greeted Lila warmly, masking his intentions behind a facade of genuine concern. The rectory was dimly lit, with candles casting a soft glow over the table. The atmosphere was intimate but professional, designed to put her at ease. They began the evening with light conversation, discussing Daniel's potential and the challenges he faced. James praised Lila for her support and devotion, laying the groundwork for what he knew would be her final moments. As the evening progressed, James poured Lila a glass of wine. He watched her closely as she took the first sip, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. The poison was odorless and tasteless, mixed seamlessly into the wine. Lila showed no immediate signs of distress, which reassured James that his plan was working. They continued to talk, with James steering the conversation toward the future and the sacrifices necessary to help Daniel achieve his full potential. It wasn't until later in the evening that Lila began to feel unwell. She mentioned feeling lightheaded and nauseous, attributing it to fatigue or perhaps the wine itself. James feigned concern, offering her water and insisting that she sit down. As her condition worsened, he called for an ambulance, ensuring that his actions would appear as those of a concerned host. By the time the paramedics arrived, Lila was barely conscious. James maintained his composure, explaining to them that she had suddenly fallen ill during their conversation. Lila was rushed to the hospital, but the poison had already done its work. Despite the doctor's efforts, she succumbed to the effects within hours. The official cause of death was listed as acute organ failure, and no one initially suspected foul play. James ensured that his behavior remained above reproach, attending her funeral and offering heartfelt condolences to her grieving family and friends. His influence and standing within the community shielded him from scrutiny, and the incident was quietly mourned as a tragic loss. For James, the plan had gone exactly as intended, but the weight of his actions lingered in the back of his mind. He had achieved his goal, but at a cost that he couldn't entirely rationalize away. The image of Lila, trusting and unaware, haunted him in quiet moments. Yet, he convinced himself that it had been necessary, a sacrifice for the greater good of his relationship with Daniel. He believed that Daniel, free from the ties that bound him, would now see the path forward more clearly. What James failed to anticipate was the ripple effect of his actions. While the community mourned Lila's death, Daniel was consumed by grief. Her sudden passing left him devastated, and he turned to James for support, unaware of the role the pastor had played in her demise. James's plan had succeeded in bringing Daniel closer to him, but the foundation of their relationship was built on a lie that threatened to unravel everything. James had crossed the line, and though he had hidden his crime well, the truth had a way of surfacing, even in the most carefully constructed deceptions. Lila's death sent shockwaves through Daniel's life. He was consumed by grief, unable to reconcile the sudden loss of someone who had been his anchor. Overwhelmed by his emotions, he sought solace in James, the one person who seemed to understand his pain. James stepped into the role of a caretaker with calculated precision, offering comfort and support while carefully masking his own culpability. He attended every vigil and memorial, ensuring his presence was seen as both dutiful and compassionate. To Daniel, James appeared to be a steady hand in a turbulent sea. However, the circumstances surrounding Lila's death began to draw attention. Some members of the congregation whispered among themselves, finding it odd that she had spent her final evening with James. The dinner invitation, while ostensibly innocent, raised questions about its necessity and timing. A few skeptics, particularly those who had always viewed James's wealth and influence with suspicion, began to quietly probe into the details. The first real break in the facade came from an unlikely source, a hospital technician reviewing Lila's toxicology report. While her death had been attributed to natural causes, the technician noted anomalies in her blood work that pointed to the possibility of poisoning. These findings, though subtle, cast doubt on the initial conclusions. The technician shared their concerns with a colleague, who then passed the information along to a local investigator. While the evidence was circumstantial, it was enough to spark a quiet inquiry. Daniel, meanwhile, began noticing inconsistencies in James's version of events. While the pastor had been a source of comfort, his recounting of that fateful evening seemed rehearsed, as though he were carefully curating the narrative. Small details didn't align, and James's insistence on focusing on Daniel's grief rather than Lila's final moments struck an odd chord. Daniel's suspicion deepened when he found Lila's phone among her belongings. Scrolling through her messages, he came across a conversation with her best friend. In it, Lila mentioned that James had insisted on the dinner, describing his demeanor as unusually serious and cryptic. She had expressed a sense of unease, noting that he seemed eager to discuss something of great importance. This revelation unsettled Daniel, prompting him to confront James indirectly. He began asking pointed questions about the dinner and Lila's sudden illness. James, typically composed, faltered under the weight of the inquiries. He deflected with vague answers, emphasizing the tragedy of her loss rather than addressing the specifics. His evasiveness only fueled Daniel's growing doubts. The young man started piecing together fragments of conversations and observations, forming a picture that he couldn't ignore. As the informal investigation gained traction, whispers about the toxicology findings reached Daniel. Though no official accusations had been made, the idea that Lila's death might not have been natural horrified him. The weight of his suspicions became unbearable, and he found himself revisiting every interaction he'd had with James in the weeks leading up to and following Lila's death. The pastor's generosity, once comforting, now seemed calculated. His unwavering support took on a sinister undertone, as though it were a means of control rather than kindness. One evening, unable to contain his turmoil, Daniel decided to search for more evidence. He revisited Lila's belongings, combing through her personal items for anything that might shed light on her final hours. Among her notes, he found a journal entry written shortly before the dinner with James. In it, Lila expressed concern over the meeting, wondering why the pastor was so insistent on discussing Daniel's future. She had even joked about the possibility of James being overly controlling, though her tone suggested she hadn't taken her own concerns seriously. Armed with this information, Daniel confronted James directly. The conversation was tense, with Daniel demanding answers and James scrambling to maintain control. The pastor's demeanor shifted from defensive to dismissive, as though he believed he could manipulate Daniel into dropping the subject. However, Daniel's persistence was unyielding, and James's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The once charismatic pastor now appeared cornered, his confidence eroding under Daniel's scrutiny. James's refusal to provide clear answers only solidified Daniel's resolve. He realized that the man he had trusted and admired was not the person he claimed to be. The seeds of doubt had grown into a full-blown certainty that James had been involved in Lila's death. Daniel knew that uncovering the truth would come at a cost, but the weight of his guilt and grief left him with no other choice. The pastor's hold over him was slipping, and for the first time, Daniel saw James not as a mentor or a lover, but as a dangerous man desperate to protect his own secrets. Daniel, tormented by his growing suspicions, decided he could no longer rely on conjecture alone. He reached out to the local police, carefully and anonymously, providing them with Lila's journal entries, text messages, and the circumstances surrounding her final meeting with Pastor James. His aim was simple: uncover the truth about Lila's death, even if it meant facing the possibility that someone he had trusted was responsible. The authorities, already aware of inconsistencies in Lila's toxicology report, took Daniel's information seriously. Detectives began to investigate quietly, retracing the events of that fateful evening. Interviews with medical staff who treated Lila revealed subtle anomalies in her symptoms that suggested poisoning. Further analysis of her blood samples confirmed the presence of a substance commonly used in rodenticides, rare and tightly regulated. Their investigation pointed to one person with both access to such a substance and proximity to the victim, Pastor James Wilkes. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered additional pieces of evidence that painted a damning picture. Financial records linked James to a supplier of the poison, masked under the pretense of pest control expenses for the church property. Witnesses recalled James's insistence on hosting the private dinner with Lila, noting how unusual it was for the pastor to meet one-on-one with congregants in such a setting. Even the seemingly benign details, the choice of wine, the specific timing of the invitation, began to align into a chilling narrative. Daniel was notified of the investigation's progress, and the confirmation of James's involvement left him devastated. The man he had idolized and loved had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Every kind gesture, every comforting word from James now felt like a calculated move to manipulate him. The weight of this realization crushed Daniel, filling him with guilt and rage. He blamed himself for not acting sooner, for allowing James's influence to blind him to the truth. His grief over Lila's death transformed into a burning desire for accountability. Unable to bear the emotional burden alone, Daniel confronted James directly. He arranged to meet him under the guise of seeking closure, choosing a neutral and public location to ensure his own safety. When they met, Daniel's composure quickly gave way to anger. He demanded to know why James had done it, why he had chosen such a monstrous path. James, cornered and desperate, tried to justify his actions. He claimed that everything he had done was out of love for Daniel, that Lila's presence was preventing them from achieving the future they deserved. But his rationalizations only fueled Daniel's fury. James's words were a grotesque distortion of love, a self-serving justification for murder. Daniel's voice shook with rage as he accused James of destroying not only Lila's life, but their own as well. The confrontation grew heated, and for the first time, James's composed facade shattered completely. He pleaded, cajoled, and threatened, cycling through every tactic in his arsenal to regain control of the situation. But Daniel was resolute. The man standing before him was no longer the mentor he had admired, but a dangerous manipulator whose actions had shattered countless lives. The meeting ended without resolution, but it marked the beginning of the end for James. Daniel, now armed with the full truth, cooperated with the police, providing testimony that corroborated their findings. His statement was the final piece of the puzzle, solidifying the case against the pastor. Shortly afterward, James was arrested in a quiet but decisive operation. The charges against him included premeditated murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of his position as a spiritual leader. The fallout from James's arrest was swift and far-reaching. The community, once devoted to him, was left reeling from the revelation of his crimes. His church, a cornerstone of the town, became a symbol of betrayal and deceit. Congregants abandoned the institution in droves, and James's allies in business and politics distanced themselves to preserve their own reputations. The wealth and power he had wielded for decades crumbled in an instant, leaving only disgrace in its wake. Daniel, overwhelmed by guilt and sorrow, chose to leave the town behind. The memories were too painful, the wounds too raw. He packed his belongings and set out to start anew, seeking a place where he could begin to heal from the trauma that had consumed his life. The road ahead was uncertain, but Daniel knew that he could no longer remain in the shadow of the past.